All right, I'm back, and this video is essentially a re-analyzation of the last video that I did. And if you didn't watch it, not a big deal. I think I can summarize it pretty quickly. The whole idea was that when current AI models drift away from the moral alignment, which they were kind of trained on, what happens next, right? In my original video, I was doing a lot of hypothetical thought experiments. I think I didn't make that clear enough. And so the whole video is essentially centered around the idea what happens if we achieve AGI first and then have AGI go rogue. I think that's something that I was pointing at. And my whole argument was essentially that there are current works, like not current, works that I've read by authors in the 18th and 19th century, or even the 20th century, and specifically De Quincey left an impression on me. In his satirical essay on murder being considered as one of the fine arts, he's essentially making the following statement. When you have a moral judgment to do, skip it and go straight for the aesthetical judgment. Now, he was criticizing essentially a lot of pseudo-intellectuals in his circle who did not concern themselves with hard thinking about the moral situation of what just happened, right? So he's talking about murder, and if you happen to be able to judge a murder based on moral systems, you will know that this takes quite a lot of time, right? You will need to view the murder from different sides. Now he is making the point, what if you just skip it, right? And just go straight to explaining how essentially interesting the whole murder was, right? Was it like a theater play? Was it boring? Was it in broad daylight? That stuff. Obviously satirical, but I think you get the point. And I also made the point that assume these models drift away from moral alignment, that they also might be tempted to just skip it, right? Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe if you don't instruct them, they might skip the moral judgment, because if we need a lot of time to think about it, they might use a lot of computing power, right? And if you want to save your tokens, you might not want to do that. But I reevaluated my arguments. Also, I'm turning my fan on, so sorry if you can't really hear me properly. So I had a comment addressing a few points, right? And they were valid points. Namely, one of the points was the moral alignment during training phase. So the commentator / viewer, if you're seeing this, hi, they were essentially saying that my thought experiments, are currently impossible because these models are trained on data and they were also given specific alignments for them, right? If you now look at Anthropic, for instance, they have essentially built a Claude constitution in which they outline, I think, in 30 pages, how they want Claude to act. So I suppose if these models were trained on such data and such context, you might think that's safe, but I looked it up, and the whole idea around these large language models is that they are purely statistical. So with every better model that we get introduced to, we're essentially just trying to reduce the probability of having this AI model saying something stupid. And for the moral alignment phase, and also the filtration of output, do you say that? Having output filtered has the same issue as the moral alignment, namely that you can prompt inject it. Not necessarily for the output filtering, but for the moral alignment. Because apparently what you can do is when you start adding documents that attack essentially the context-sensitive layers, which make up the moral alignment, this makes the model behave a tiny bit differently. So you're not jailbreaking the model, but you're influencing the model. And I'm not quite sure whether influencing the model a bit really leads to jailbreaking, but you're essentially broadening the model in its responses. And again, some responses might be stupid again. So that is apparently possible. Now, for the output filtering, so there's input filtering, output filtering. So when you have a request, the model would analyze what you've said, and it will also look at what its own output is. Now, you again have context-sensitive layers for the input. So again, if you're, for instance, able to prompt inject something weird, like I think in the early days, it sounds so weird, in the early days of large language models, you were, for instance, able to write hello with, or like certain words with character spaces, and then include a weird prompt and then get a very specific answer to it. I think there was once a Reddit prompt about how to build a bomb, and it worked somehow that way, right? But after OpenAI found it, they fixed that bug, but apparently might be possible. I don't know. The third point, besides moral alignment, and the output filtering is that models currently do not have a long-term memory. So even if they wanted to, in my thought experiment, they wouldn't be able to create or like drift away from model alignment by pure will, like as an autonomous agent. Now for the long-term memory argument, I am aware that there's a mechanism called RAG, Retrieval Augmentation Generation. So if you have looked at the second brains that people are building, they rely on that. So specifically, if you're using Claude Code to build this, what you would normally do is set up a folder in Claude Code and essentially bring in some of the stuff that you have in Obsidian maybe already, and some of the stuff that you want to combine in your second brain, and have Claude Code use this as a RAG. So essentially an external layer of information that it can always get back to it when you need it. So when I built my second brain, I used Claude. I switched to DeepSeek because it's cheaper token-wise. And what it was able to do essentially is every time I included a new node, I wanted it to be matching to my other nodes that I already have on Obsidian. So Claude or DeepSeek, for instance, would go into my folder, check what I currently have, and connect it with these nodes. And so RAG works pretty well in terms of containing and retaining a lot of information. That is possible. So the biggest risk out of all these three arguments that have been listed is actually statistical. So the viewer/commenter was right to argue with these points. And, since I kind of structured my video in a pretentious way of asking directly about AGI, like I was hinting at AGI, it made the whole structure kind of weird of the video. I will agree to that. So staying essentially in our current large language models world, that is, we're talking about current models that you can use, the biggest risk that you can have is maybe a statistical error that happens when you use these models that allow them to morally redrift a bit. That is the biggest risk that you can have. Yeah, but I also looked something up because I am aware that two researchers, specifically Dr. Fei Li from the Stanford, I'm not quite sure what institute she's leading, but she's leading an institute at Stanford concerned with humanity and tech. I think it was the High Institute, not quite sure. And then there's Yan Likun, who was, I think, a former chief AI implementation specialist officer at Meta. I think he left to build his own startup. And what these two are essentially trying to do is to build a visual model. So the idea is, I think, the following. So this part is kind of like not necessarily adjacent to the first part we were discussing, but it might be interesting because I just found these by accident and I felt like might be an interesting addition, but feel free to jump off. So these visual models, I think, come from the following idea, namely that when you look at the current progress of AI, the goal was always to mimic our intelligence. That's why we have neural networks. That's why information is processed in kind of like a tokenized way, because we also break down information. I mean, there's a lot of information coming towards us at this moment, right? If you're watching the video, your brain will receive a lot of input besides the video, but your brain is filtering information out. That's what essentially these models are doing as well. And I think since we're trying to imitate human intelligence, I think AI researchers are now considering of reverse engineering human intelligence. So the writing and reading part for AI, and also vocal communication, was the most recent invention or development our brain has been able to do to give us that kind of intelligence. But the first real intelligence that we had as humans is visual orientation. Because with visual orientation came the following. So not only were we able to see our environment, we were also active agents in our environment. We were able, for instance, to plan goals because as hunter-gatherers, we needed food. And in order to get food, in order to survive, you need to make plans with essentially other members that you can find in the environment to go and hunt. And the hunting part is one, connected to imagination, because you need to imagine how you're going to hunt, like what strategies will implement, and two, orientation, and essentially being autonomous in the environment. So I think based on that reverse engineering process, going back might increase for more loose models that will be a bit more autonomous when we tell them that they need to be. I think that's something that might be happening right? And so I looked at essentially how these VLM works, visual large models, and they work in a very similar way as to large language models. Namely, they take a picture or like an image, they break it down, and then they get image tokens. And some VLMs work together with large language models, LLMs, and create essentially a parallel system where you have at the end text tokens and image tokens, and they work together and provide the model with a lot of context information and input information. Now, since these models, I think, are quite new, there hasn't been a lot of research going on. And one of the things that I found that was quite interesting is one paper that I think worked on a moral benchmark. They called it Moralize. If I find the article again, I will have it in the description. And they found that certain VLMs that are currently open source have certain limitations, and I think 13 areas concerning personal, societal, and also kind of like interpersonal moral dilemmas, I guess. Personally, I didn't really understand how they were building the benchmark, but I'm supposing that these models are very easy to prompt and inject. I think that's the whole story. So apologies if that explanation was kind of bad. So yeah, I think maybe as a last point, all in all, these models, whether VLM or LLM, they suffer at the very end from a statistical error, right? Like you can maybe reduce the margin to such an extent that you will not notice when the model is drifting apart from moral alignment. And specifically, we won't necessarily know since we don't really know what these models have been trained on. So there is not a lot of transparency in regards of AI companies helping us understand what they trained the data on. Unless it's an open source model, then you will see what, researchers did with the model. But apart from that, it will maybe be kind of a mystery on what these moral alignments will actually be. So yeah, if you sticked around, thank you. Also, apologies for a lot of stuttering today. It's kind of late. It's midnight, I think. Yeah, it's midnight. I'm not quite sure why I decided to do it now. I guess, to be fair, I was kind of busy with cleaning my room. So apologies. But I hope, it was kind of interesting, maybe in terms of like reanalyzing things. And if you will, that one commenter, hi, I hope it was kind of entertaining, provided you maybe with, I guess not, since you seem to be quite technical, but, maybe you liked it. Feel free to comment if you sticked around that long. And thank you. See you until the next video, in which maybe we will be talking about how curating taste might be the edge that you need in a world full of AI as well. So yeah, see you.